world. If you live in this part of the world, you definitely would either have gotten malaria or have treated malaria, or you know someone who was treated for malaria, or you have even been admitted because of malaria. So it's a big problem, it's a big issue in this part of the world. But then there's an emerging problem, which is resistance to malaria treatments. And some of the reasons are a poor compliance with drugs. Sometimes people get the drugs but don't complete their treatments. Some of them is poor drug quality. Some of them is also, which is where majority of the problem comes from, and that is the malaria parasites itself developing resistance to these drugs. So how can we deal with this? First of all, is compliance. When you get drugs for treatment for malaria, you have to take the drugs as they are prescribed, and you have to take them completely. So most people feel better after the first dose or after the second dose. So most times, most people don't take the complete 3 days. It's usually 3 days of treatment. So eventually, over time, the malaria parasites build resistance to these drugs. And we find out that after 2-3 years of a new drug coming out, we see people treating malaria coming back next week. You still see the malaria parasite positive. 2-3 weeks, and then using 2-3 different drugs. By the time we're using 3-4 different drugs and we are still getting positive malaria parasites, that is when we call it multi-drug resistant malaria. And in that case, most times the treatment is only by intravenous anti-malaria. So we must understand that the malaria parasites are transmitted from an infected person to another infected person. So it's actually the same parasites that is moving around the population. So the solution to this is, number one, you have to complete your malaria treatment. If you get drugs, you have to take them fully. But what if you take them fully and it doesn't work, and then you get a different anti-malaria, it doesn't also work? In that case, we are dealing with multi-drug resistant malaria. In such cases, there are special prescribed medications, most of them intravenous, that are used to treat this malaria, and it's always necessary to go to the hospital so that that can be done. When we talk of resistant malaria, one of the cases that is, I think, very familiar with many people is the absence today of chloroquine being used as a monotherapy. That is, chloroquine used as the singular drug to treat malaria. And the federal government banned chloroquine in 2005 because of the incidences of high resistance. Many people were taking this drug and it wasn't working. We can say malaria is resistant to treatment when you have completed a full course of malaria treatment of any of the drugs, the common drugs, the ACT, which is artemisinin combined therapy, and you still find malaria parasites in the blood after completing treatments. So in many cases, people have developed resistance to malaria because they do not complete their malaria treatment. Other causes of malaria resistance is the poor quality of drugs that are sometimes supplied by the drug companies. And the other cause is the malaria parasite itself over time develops resistance to the drugs. So when we look at malaria treatment over the years, we find that there's almost always a new malaria treatment coming out every few years, and that is because after 2-3 years, we begin to see a lot of treatment failure. So the drug doesn't respond to treatment anymore. So this problem of high resistance of malaria to treatment can be tackled by a combination of both government and patients, and even the health providers working together. So in the first place, the government has to produce strict rules for drug companies to keep up to a particular standard so that we have good quality anti-malaria drugs in the markets. For the patients, they have to comply with the treatment. So the health provider has to explain to the patient the specific way the drugs should be taken. The patient should keep to the prescription. Resistant malaria is a big issue because the first and foremost will be economic. Number one, you find that people treat malaria for an extended period of time. A treatment which shouldn't last more than 3 days, you find people going for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, treating the same disease. And not only are you treating the same disease, it's getting progressively worse because it's not being treated. The other problem is also the fact that with each case of resistance, you can be certain that you are going to get more cases because the malaria parasite is transmitted from an infected person. So we find that the resistant malaria in one person is moved by mosquitoes to another person. So not only the patients, health providers, and governments, the major points to tackle malaria should be prevention. Basically, to prevent malaria, the major point is hygiene. Once you've gotten the hygiene tackled and you've gotten your mosquito nets, you can be sure that resistant malaria, but as a basis, malaria itself is brought to a minimum. And the target of World Health Organization is towards zero malaria occurrence. So invest, innovate, and implement. So this year, the focus will be on implementation of bringing malaria parasites in the parts of the world where we find malaria, which is South America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and bring it from the high numbers we are finding today to zero malaria infections. I think with a little bit of work from the individual, the health provider, the government, we can be able to achieve that. Thank you very much.